Carrying on, we're now in section 7.2 of Griffin's work, and this is the relativity of human rights. Well, he's still trying to chip away at this notion of, oh yeah, there's so much disagreement and it's just a mess. No, it's not, says Griffin. Just because and he comes up, he tries to, offer some counters to this. So just because an idea, and I'm giving it in a more abstract form than Griffin does, but just because you find an idea and it comes from a certain culture or region, and we'll call it like the idea Q. Okay, so Q comes from someplace Z. That doesn't mean that Q is essentially tied to Z and Z's culture. So you don't want to make an inference like, oh, Q comes from Z. Well, then Q only means something in the context of Z's culture. That's very debatable. You can find pretty strong counterexamples to that, says Griffin. And I just pulled, I always like taking examples from natural science. I mean, all ideas in science, you can trace them. Historians do this all the time. Historians of science, they try to trace them. Yeah, we fight a lot about where the idea came from. But that's different than saying that the idea's origin limits the truth of the idea or something. Those are totally different questions. Like who came up with the idea is very different than asking whether or not the idea is true. Like you got to be very careful about keeping that stuff all separate. Okay, so let's look at Einstein's general theory of relativity. Now, if you've ever studied that stuff, it's just pages of math, right? And then it's a theoretical approach to understanding how the universe works, and it's built on a lot of foundations that were devised by other mathematicians, et cetera, et cetera. So, but would you say that Einstein's general theory of relativity is intrinsically German or Western? It's taught around the world. It's used everywhere, right? All scientists, they use it. Same thing with quantum mechanics. Who cares where from the truth of it, where it originates? You go out and you use it and you test it against the world and see if it works. And if it works well, then you can argue about whether it's absolutely true or whatever. But that's the pathway to talking about the truth, is not to say, well, where did it come from? It's like, well, what does it say? And how does that reflect and how does that affect what we see in the lab and predict and all that kind of stuff? I mean, think about when, like when in the early in the 20th century in Nazi Germany, they did try to say something like, well, Einstein was of Jewish origin, and some, they tried to brand it as Jewish science or something like that. Basically it looked like nonsense. So no, it's very difficult, to saying things like mathematics is intrinsically cultural. These, you might be able to make an argument, but again, you have to make a really strong argument for that, not just assert it, right? If you want to assert it, well, fine. But remember, in the previous video, you can assert lots of things. You can just dig your heels in and say, yeah, science, even general relativity, is intrinsically a cultural product. You can assert that, but you'd have to argue it. And I've been in this business a long time, and I'm not seeing great arguments that the mathematical foundations of general relativity are intrinsically cultural. I've never seen a really good argument that leads to that as a conclusion. But I've heard it asserted, but those are different. Okay, so if we can say something like this here, this view of Q coming from Z but not being essentially Z-centric, if we can find an example of that, like, yeah, general relativity comes from, largely from Einstein, but it has, all kinds of origins. But let's just, for the purpose of discussion, say, yeah, it originates in Germany or Europe. But we wouldn't say it's essentially a Eurocentric view of the world. There's lots of Eurocentric views of the world. I'm not debating that by any stretch. I'm just saying I don't think general relativity is a Eurocentric view. Okay, so if that is a good example or a clear or pretty non-controversial example, and Griffin wants to say, look, values also have a certain kind of objectivity, maybe not as high as science, fine, but he thinks it's much higher than most people think. So this disagreement over values again, Griffin has said this is overestimated, and he goes repeatedly to discuss, well, things maybe used to be, but there's a convergence of values. Lots of notions of values in cultures have changed over time. So, we should be careful about this. And also when we ask the question, is there divergence over values? You should have contemporary understandings, modern understandings of cultures, and not be looking at cultures maybe through a lens of 50, 60 years ago, because certain views, think about it, certain views today, like in liberal democracies, like Canada, even in my lifetime, many values or attitudes towards certain ideas, they've changed a lot. So, you could, like think about issues like same-sex marriage and all that kind of stuff. When I was much younger, there were different views on that. So people's views on values inside of cultures change, and the whole culture, you could say, as a consequence, it changes. So, well, other cultures could, and so often you can find convergence. That's basically what Griffin is saying. And so he says, now let's look at some things like certain values, like autonomy. And sometimes autonomy is contrasted with solidarity. Like, so some are more atomistic societies, and then some are more communal societies. And so some societies, look more for autonomy. Yeah, they love autonomy. It's often said that the West is just madly in love with autonomy, and countries that don't consider themselves Western or are not part of however you want to frame it, that they're more communitarian and more interested in solidarity and community. Fine, you might be able to say certain things like that, says Griffin, but when you start digging in, you're going to find that stuff is largely, again, exaggerated. So Griffin often gives us a kind of what I would call sort of just think about it seriously and look closely. Wittgenstein used to say something like this, and we've seen that Griffin refers to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, I always thought was funny as a philosopher. He would say, stop thinking and just go look. Don't think, look. And that's not bad advice, right? Sometimes it's a good idea to just look at things and say, well, let's look at these cultures. Are they really all that different when they look at autonomy? Or is it more that some lean a little bit more and some a little bit this way or that way? Okay, Griffin says something like this. It would be that in even cultures that value autonomy, let's say you pick a culture that really values autonomy, they might say something like this. Well, even though I value autonomy, and I think it's really important, I'm not going to accept that I will not say something like, I will in never way ever trade any autonomy for some solidarity with my fellow citizens. No, I'll accept some kinds of trade-offs, even though, I privilege and I really love autonomy. I'm not just going to absolutely say, no, don't, it's sacrosanct, don't touch it in any way. So I would accept some trade-offs against autonomy, even though I tend to be leaning towards the autonomous side. Fine. So then the communitarian solidarity type person comes in and says, hey, I value solidarity and community stuff too, and I always privilege that. Absolutely, we must look for more social cohesion. We're all in this together. Yep. Okay. So, however, there might be some things that I would be willing to trade off. Hey, that's a private thing. I would sacrifice some kinds of things in favor of the other side. So as somebody who's more strongly on the solidarity side, I wouldn't say, oh, don't ever touch that. That's perfectly sacrosanct. Well, both the autonomy person and the solidarity person are both saying, well, we privilege one, but we're not just not into the stratosphere that you don't have any trade-offs. Griffin says if you start getting these people to start talking to each other, you're going to find that they're much closer, not necessarily identical. They don't have to be for Griffin's argument, but it would be like basically we don't privilege any one thing. Absolutely, we have trade-offs. We might have slightly different trade-offs. Maybe on some very particular issues we might have quite a difference, but maybe globally overall the differences are not that much. It's just more of a leaning in one direction than the other. So it's not incommensurate or in a strong sense, well, I can't talk to those autonomy people over there, and the autonomy people, I can't talk to the solidarity people. It's nowhere near that, but it's easy to exaggerate these differences and think that you're like that. Um, so and think about even I come from a liberal democracy. We trade off our autonomy in all kinds of ways. Like even sometimes we say you're more autonomous when you trade off certain parts of your autonomy. Like many people would make the argument that well, if you're thinking about relativity theory, you better go talk to some physicists and learn from them. So you kind of go there to learn, and you're not walking in there telling them what it's about. So the idea of respecting your own autonomy by deferring to expertise in others in certain areas, that's a judgment that says that sometimes it's more rational and autonomous to forfeit a bit of your autonomy. You actually become more autonomous in the end because you're more likely to be right about the physical world. So this is just to say that a lot of these things about autonomy and being privileged, it's not a radical absolute kind of thing. So again, that's all grist to shall we say the Griffin mill, that he's saying it's let's not overestimate and exaggerate all these distinctions. And of course, once you start looking at autonomy, Griffin thinks that even people on this side, you're going to value certain things. You're going to value autonomy, even if you're on the solidarity side. And yeah, there's a good reason, says Griffin, that the solidarity person might say, yeah, this should be protected. That's not a bad idea. So again, it's a look, don't think, look, Wittgensteinian type of argument. And so there's so then there's the question of okay, well, when we move from this sort of discussion about values and things like that, and they're not all that different, and it was like all things. So keep in mind all the discussion that the values, let's not over exaggerate, let's not overestimate, etc., etc. We're not all that different on these things. But now we're moving from autonomy is valuable, yes, 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 to we're going to make it a human right. Now, does everybody want to do that? Can other, you can, and Griffin does it too. Just because something is morally important, like distributive justice or things like that, does that mean you want to build it in to the system of human rights? Remember, if you do, then you're going down that slippery slope of morally valuable means if X is morally valuable, then X is got to be protected by a human right. So everything, yeah, it's morally valuable if people are polite. Well, do you have a human right? Is your human rights being violated if people are impolite, right? Even if we admit something's morally important, do we want to go down the line of saying it's a human right? Now, Griffin, as we've seen, has wanted to put the brakes on that, that he doesn't want everything to turn into a human right. So what about when we go from this to this? Is this a good idea? Well, Griffin is going to say yes, even though that the contents of rights are going to have empirical conditions, because now once we move from this little box here of sort of prudence now to a very subset of morality of rights, you're now bringing in the empirical conditions that he's talked about. Now you're getting to practices, and so now you're doing policy. So now there's empirical differences, and as we've seen, empirical differences can make a difference in these evaluative or these ethical frameworks. So you have prudential values are involved when you're constructing human rights. Facts about human nature are now involved when you're talking about human rights, and facts about how societies work. And so everything, this is a lot more complicated. So Griffin thinks that we can have a kind of non-arbitrary notion of these values, and we can get a sort of a non-arbitrary notion of human rights. So it's not essentially, tied to the West or tied to a culture. But don't think that non-arbitrary means it's real like a stone or a building. It's real in the sense that it plays a good role in our ethical thinking. Remember when I talked about electrons being real because they play roles in our best kinds of theories. So you can get something off the ground by saying, well, you've got something like X is factual. So we can get sort of the human rights as sort of factual notions in our ways of thinking and experiencing the world, but we don't necessarily get them to the level of being, you know, like real, like stones or buildings. You know, like there's a stone, there's a building, and there's a human right. It's not on that level. Um, so we can have factual ones like about the way they can serve human interests, and then we can incorporate that into practices in society, taking account the empirical conditions as well. So you can get things up on a kind of factual level that's pretty close to the objectivity that you get in science, but it's not quite there. And of course, Griffin says, look, you know, in the end, what he hasn't done, and he states it very clearly, is he hasn't provided a global refutation of strong forms of skepticism, right? Like you could still be a moral skeptic, Griffin says. If you want to dig your heels in and say, you know, you haven't really shown for sure that there are such things as objective moral values and objective judgments and whatnot, he's going to admit that. Like, no, he hasn't done that. I don't think that that probably even could be done. I've got my Aristotelian leanings where I just don't think ethics is going to ever give you those kinds of answers. And if you're looking for those kinds of answers, I think that's like, I would argue that that's just such a long shot. You're just not going to find something like that in doing ethics. But that doesn't mean that you just throw your hands up and say it's all arbitrary. So they can have a high level of objectivity, but again, remember, as I said in a previous area, you don't have that God's eye view on things. You don't even get that in science. Science has got a limited objectivity as well. But as in this discussion, it's not going to be tied like, you know, we can say things in the philosophy of science that it's not purely objective because we can't stand outside of science and go, there's science and there's the world. Does it fit? We're not God, right? That's God who gets to do that. We're in Neurath's boat. We're in Neurath's boat with all of these judgments, but that doesn't mean just anything goes, right? And so we can have a high level of a degree of objectivity with human rights, and not that much more relativism than a lot of, you know, judgments in science. So if you study a lot of philosophy of science, it can help see these kinds of arguments regarding a little more clearly what Griffin is trying to get off the ground. But if you see science and is, you know, absolutely pristine and perfect in a God's eye view, and that you say, oh, that's objectivity, and ethics doesn't do that, then ethics just, well, that's actually a fairly bad argument. You have to be a little bit more clear on what's reasonable levels of objectivity. But again, Griffin says, I haven't solved the radical skeptics problem of, you know, this could still all in the end just simply not be true. But he thinks that there's good reasons to reject that and say that we can have some fairly high confidence of the objectivity and the non-ethnocentric nature of human rights.